Today's conversation is with Céline Bak. I've known Céline for probably 20 years. She is kind of a technical sustainability person. She's won awards. She's francophone. And I think you'll really enjoy the conversation with Céline about her career.
I guess my first question for you is, could you tell us a little bit about your educational background and how you got your first job in your desired field?
Okay, so I went to high school in Ottawa, in a suburb, and had my undergraduate degree at the University of Guelph. And then because of support from professors at the University of Guelph, I applied for a Rotary Foundation scholarship and went to the UK to do an MBA at the University of Bath.
That's awesome. And then
Yeah, so how did I?
following that, how did you
Yeah,
get your first job?
my first job, I was very, very lucky. I went to do my master's at Bath, and Bath had a relationship with British Airways. And so my first job was to be a management consulting, providing advice to British Airways. And I did that with a focus on understanding one of their large cost centers and how that cost center could actually be a way to generate revenue and to make the business more profitable. And that was a pretty fun thing to do, as someone who just graduated from an MBA program. From there, it became possible for me to look for a job in management consulting, which was really a dream. And so I had the opportunity to choose between working at McKinsey and working at what was called at the time A.T. Kearney. And I chose to work at A.T. Kearney for two reasons. One, because I felt that the leader of the Toronto office of A.T. Kearney was a very trustworthy person. His name is Brian Harrison, and he still is someone I'm in touch with. And secondly, because I wanted to work with companies in the real economy. And had I worked with McKinsey, that might have been the case, but I might also have found myself working more in the financial industry, which is, more what McKinsey has, I guess, become known for. Whereas, at Kearney, I got to work with some of the world's biggest manufacturers and understand really what are the underpinnings of a several billion-dollar company. And I had the opportunity to, with two other colleagues, write the first business process reengineering methodology for the company. And that was a defining experience for me because it's followed me as a foundational way of looking at organizations and businesses for the rest of my life.
It's really cool. And was that located in the UK?
No,
or back
this
here
is in
Canada
Toronto.
or anywhere else?
I moved to Toronto after I had done my master's in the UK. I guess it is important to know that, although I worked for a Canadian company and my boss was in Toronto, I spent most of the whole time I was at Kearney until 1998 working in the US, in the UK, and in Spain. And that was an extraordinary privilege because it just gave me exposure to business cultures that are very different and also to live in different places. My husband is from Spain, and so at one point we decided that it would be a good thing to live in Spain, and so I asked for a transfer to the Madrid office, and I worked in the Madrid office.
Awesome. So this class that we're taking, that this is an assignment for, it's for a lot of geography, environmental governance, environmental science majors. So I guess at what point did you kind of pivot into a more environmental focus after your MBA in your first career?
So, the beginning of my career was in industrials. The next part of my career was in technology, being telecommunications, and I did that based in Madrid and also in Ottawa, and then in Ottawa. And in those roles, I guess I got the underpinnings of a career in environmentally related technologies. It was out of deep frustration regarding how we as a country had decided to sort of walk away from intellectual property, which had been built and human networks that had been built over a very long time in telecommunications, that I decided to make sure that that wasn't going to happen with our next important industry. And that's when I thought, well, we've built industries in the past, including with IP and with manufacturing and with global supply chains. And the last one, or one of the last ones which we had built that way, was the civil aviation industry. And so I sat down and I thought about how we had sort of nurtured, an ecosystem of a certain number of companies to become um, leaders in different fields, including in engine, building engines, building airplanes, building flight simulators, and doing that with industrial policy. And so I knew that we needed to steward the planet and that we needed to reduce emissions. And so in 2009, I wrote the first Canadian Clean Technology Industry Report. And I did that by basically identifying and getting to know leaders in hundreds of innovation-based environmental and climate related companies. And I brought a prop. This was the last one. I don't know if you can see it there. That was the last one.
I
Yeah.
do recognize that the front. That was very similar.
It was on the agenda, which is a quintessential Ontario long form journalism. I think perhaps almost like a precursor of a podcast that, people got to know about the Canadian clean technology industry, and many reporters took the trouble to understand it. I'm thinking of Sean McCarthy at the Globe and Mail and others at other newspapers. And so over time, we built an understanding, and the people who make policy decisions, whether they're at the provincial level or the federal level, made billions and billions of dollars of decisions that 10 years ago created the basis for things that I continue to work on today.
It's interesting. And that actually kind of goes into my next question a little bit. But if you want to touch about why you've stayed in this field, I guess, up to date, and if you have any words on
Thank
that.
you. That's a really important question. I think, all of us make choices every day about what we want to spend our time on, right? And those, to be honest, are some of the most important decisions that we make. We spend time with our family, spend time with our friends, we spend time doing things that we love and that make us feel like we're being our best selves. And so one of the reasons why I continue to work in this field is because it's a field where we still have a lot to do, and where there are people who have been making contributions for quite a long time, and more people who are joining the field and, bringing great talent and energy and direction. And so it's a place where, I say that I'm 21 plus 41 years of experience. So, or even someone who's still learning and still taking a walk in the fog to try and do something I've never done before, we can do that with good people, and for obviously a very important purpose.
Awesome. And I guess we'll jump maybe forward a little bit, and correct me if I pronounce this wrong, but you are currently the founder and president of Analytica Advisors. How did that happen? That's a pretty impressive title.
Analytica Advisors is the publisher of the Canadian Clean Technology Industry Report, and we called ourselves Analytica simply because we've always tried to do everything on the basis of evidence. Sometimes we had to collect the evidence ourselves by finding the 850 some companies that were working in Canada, and by asking them to answer detailed questionnaires, by engaging the Canadian Revenue Agency to look at its data, obviously in a confidential way, blinded way, but to produce information that we could make really solid decisions on. I now have the pleasure of being a senior advisor to companies that are starting up in new areas in the financial sector. And so the foundations, the evidence-based foundations and the people-based foundations of Analytica Advisors are literally part of my everyday work as I try to help form pools of money to be able to invest in the energy transition. And that can be community connected renewable energy and energy efficiency and low carbon fuels and a whole number of different areas, but always on the basis of bringing people together and having solid information to be able to make really good decisions.
Awesome. So you've touched on it already a few times, but the clean energy report that you shared with me from 2017, could you walk us through I guess, how you got that opportunity, what your contribution was to that, and how that's kind of transitioned you in your career since?
Yeah, so the Canadian Clean Technology Industry Report included clean energy, but it also included other parts of sort of environmental innovation. It helped for me to understand what it's like to start a company in Canada that may or may not have the benefit of regulation, whether that regulation is water-related regulation or carbon-related regulation or electricity, and how one can attract investors to build a company, to be able to invest in a product, to bring that product to market internationally, to have customers, around the world, and to hire people. It's an interesting process, right? To decide, okay, we need to hire someone in this part of the business or in that part of the business. And so one of the organizations that made it possible for the Clean Technology Industry Report to exist, well, actually, there are four. They are each of the major departments in the federal government who are responsible for the environment and the economy. And they include global affairs and specifically the Trade Commission, which has had a huge focus on clean technology and Canadian solutions. Environment and Climate Change Canada is another example. ISED, the department responsible for innovation, science, and economic development. And then Natural Resources Canada, which is basically Canada's Department of Energy and all natural resources. Those four departments, plus their provincial counterparts who wanted evidence to be able to make good decisions, they all contributed to make the Canadian Clean Technology Industry Report possible. That became a platform for me to work on finance because at the end, a company needs revenue, it needs to be able to manage its costs, and it needs investment. And so I turned my attention to how investors were looking at both small and medium-sized companies like the ones in the report and big companies. And so that took me to work on disclosure regulations for companies, for them to disclose their climate-related financial risks. And it led me to work on things, I guess, in global governance, so that there was sort of pressure from the G7 and the G20 on governments to enact policies that would enable us to be able to live within the Earth's boundaries while at the same time taking care of each other and giving each other opportunities to work in really good careers.
This is actually a little bit off script, but yesterday I was actually sitting in a seminar. It was for a mining panel. I'm going to PDAC this weekend, the big mining conference in Toronto. And a lot of the conversation was about sustainable mining and that connection between government and industry. Do you have any insight on what it's like to work with the government on the industry side, or any insight on
Yeah,
that?
so that's actually a really, really important question. And I guess I'll answer it by saying that from a government perspective, as someone who has advised the government and who has been consulted and who's been a witness before Parliament and things that have to do with government, one thing that's really, really tricky is to make sure that best available technology is considered in government policy. And best available technology may or may not be something that comes from a large incumbent company that has the means to come to Ottawa and be consulted. And so what that means is that, the government has to be attuned to weak signals. And I'll give you an example of that. Recently, I've been working with Carbon Removal Canada to write recommendations around how to attract capital to the technologies that would remove carbon from the atmosphere. And some of them, they're relatively new, are related to the mining industry. And one of them in particular called carbon mineralization uses tailings from mines that have certain properties that they actually can chemically sequester carbon forever. It's a permanent solution. It takes carbon out of the atmosphere and it'll stay there. From a government perspective, it's important that there be openness to these new solutions. From a sort of a company perspective, and I'll look at it from two sides. One is publicly traded companies, and then all the other companies, some of which are larger and some of which are smaller. Publicly traded companies are under a lot of pressure because every quarter they need to report to their shareholders and they need to be able to say that they delivered the profit that they said they would deliver. And so it means they're making choices about what to invest in. And one of the things that I do, which is part of the analytical tradition, is that I do research on how publicly traded companies are rewarded by shareholders and capital markets for investing in sustainability, for investing in carbon reduction, for investing in any capital projects, any big projects, like, for example, the conversion of tailings into carbon reducing sort of business models. And what the data tells us is that there is evidence that it is good business to be a leader in investing in sustainability, that revenues grow more quickly, that profit grows, and that, obviously as profit comes in, you can invest more and then, the flywheel goes. For small companies, access to capital comes in two forms. Access to capital to invest in sustainability. You can either borrow money or you can seek investors. And so the thing I do today and my work now is to work on gaining the trust of investors on the one hand and of companies on the other hand to be able to provide private credit, which is basically to enable a company that isn't publicly traded and doesn't have access to capital markets for debt and that may not be able to get all the credit it wants from a bank, to provide an alternative so that they can invest in their growth and they can invest in sustainability in a way which is really good for their business.
It's really insightful, and those kind of similar conversations we were having yesterday.
Okay.
So I felt that was just kind of interesting and something I'm looking forward to.
PDAC is quite the event
as well.
There's a lot of people there.
That's what I've heard. This will be my first
wear
time.
Comfortable shoes. Yeah.
Okay. That's good to know because I got told to dress just for an interview.
With comfortable
and I wasn't sure if
shoes.
that meant, heels or running
with
shoes.
Comfortable shoes.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to hop back just to the clean tech report too for a second. This was something that I pulled out of it that I thought was quite interesting. Your research showed that 23% of clean tech workers are under 30 right now. What skills do young professionals need to thrive and succeed in this sector?
That's a great question. I think there are some specific skill sets, and in the report there's actually a page on marketing skill sets in particular. But I think the curiosity and the willingness to uncover stones, right? To look at, where something may or may not be of value is really important. And I'll give you a good example. Just last week, I was chatting with the CEO of a very innovative company that makes low carbon fuels in a way which is compliant with the very highest standards. And their inputs, their feedstocks are methane, including methane from landfill. And I don't know anything about methane from landfill, except I know it's dangerous and I know that there's a lot of it. And so I began to just look for cities that have landfills and that are in places where the grid carbon intensity is low and which could potentially provide a 20-year contract for a significant amount of methane. And we found one. And and so I wrote to that city and I said, would you be interested in a meeting with this company? And they said yes. And so, something will happen potentially. So it's obviously, the ability to take a little walk in the fog is really important. It also takes time to become comfortable in your core, whatever your core sort of professional skill set is. And I guess I would say that if you have the opportunity to get 10,000 hour mark quickly, take it. And I know it's hard because it makes for long days, but it's really, really useful to get that done as soon as possible because then you're building more quickly on those foundations. And so whatever you choose to do, take the opportunity to maybe do the intense part in the beginning of your career and it'll serve you very well.
Awesome. That actually segues perfectly into a question. And I was going to share just with anyone who might be seeing this later on the advice that you had sent me via email before we chatted here. And I had a quick question about that. So I'm going to go over that quickly. The first piece of advice you said was read about people before you meet them for the first, second, third, and fourth time. That was particularly helpful before this podcast. So thank you for that. And the second one was, as you mentioned, 10,000 hours are a thing. The third thing you said was work with people you enjoy. Then you said, do what you say and say what you do. And the last one was what I wanted to kind of delve a little bit more into, was get off the critical path as soon as you can while delivering quality work. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on what the critical path is?
So I'll go back to the example I gave a second ago. This CEO from a US-based company said, well, are there sources could we find a good feedstock provider for methane? And I said, well, let me look. And so I did. And therefore, and then I said to him, well, here's some ideas. And so he said, yeah, those two are good ones. And I said, okay, well, why don't we find out if they're interested? And one of the two was. And so at every step, I did what I could, or what I should, as quickly as possible, so that, and of sufficient quality, because you garbage in, garbage out. You do need to actually have a solid answer to the point where today, we had a conversation. I said, well, so do you want to be in touch with that city that said that, yes, they have methane? And so I got off the critical path as quickly as I could. And that led to someone, who would never have thought of Canada as a potential place to build a plant, having a chat with a serious potential partner. And so it wasn't complicated, but it's just this idea that if you see an opportunity, do your part as quickly as you can, and then hand it to the next person. And that way, you're not the rate limiting factor in things moving ahead. Now, sometimes that's hard, right? It means that today I was preparing for a conversation about a panel which I'll be moderating at a conference, and I had made a commitment to someone to get back to them about the carbon intensity modeling of the low carbon fuels regulation in Canada. And so it meant that I downloaded the model, I downloaded the data, I looked at the operating manual, just so that I could say that, yeah, you can do this works, and I could recommend to them that they should take a minute to model their business, because there's an opportunity. There's a new regulation. There'll be investment. So I got off the critical path, but I did it in such a way that I knew I wasn't giving them a wrong steer, that I could do that with integrity and knowing that I was giving them good advice.
I guess this is a little bit more focused to new graduates as well, but still on that idea of clean tech and how we navigate sustainability right now. Where do you see the biggest opportunity for new graduates in this field?
Well, there are large organizations that are hiring new graduates from STEM. That was in touch with someone, an intern, where I am a senior advisor, and within 3 months, he found as an engineer in a larger company. And I think that those opportunities are super to start with. It's when you've worked, and I had a chat with a younger person, I guess a month or two ago, and he was asking me for some advice. And I said, well, you've been with a larger company now for 5 or 8 years. It's time for you to go to a smaller company. It's time for you to be in a place where you can have much more responsibility very quickly, because they will recognize your talent and capabilities, and you're going to find yourself leading things which you will not be able to lead in this larger company. So those are some general thoughts I have. Now, those larger companies, they can be companies doing renewable energy. They can be companies doing finance. They can be banks. They can be investment companies. All of them are looking for young people who have STEM backgrounds, who are good communicators, who aren't afraid of taking a walk in the fog and learning something and doing it so in such a way that they do what they say and say what they do.
Awesome. Okay, cool. And that's kind of an interesting perspective, because I think I'm coming up to graduation in a few months, which is a terrifying thought. But I have this conversation with my friends a lot about what you want to do. And there's a lot of different paths, particularly in the environmental field, where you can kind of, you can go the government route, industry route, or a lot of consulting is quite popular too. But I was also chatting with someone recently, and they were saying to not go into consulting right away and to also go to, if you can, work for a larger company to get that experience. So it's just really interesting to hear that perspective on another side
Yeah,
of
so
it
I
as well.
started in a big company, and then I went to a small company, and then I went to another small company, and then
Yeah.
I founded my own company. And now I'm helping someone found a company. So it's kind of an interesting
Awesome.
sort of trajectory. And in the middle,
Yeah.
I worked with government and I learned about government. So I think, there are government offers huge opportunities, and I actually should have mentioned also civil society, which is where so much important work gets done. But I would say that before, heading into a career in civil society, it would be really useful to have some experience from a larger company.
One thing I wanted to ask, and this could be professional or personal, however you feel comfortable sharing, but what's the big obstacle that you have faced in this field?
That's a really good question. I mean, when things change, it's a big obstacle. And so, for example, a lot of work has gone into certain regulatory sort of frameworks, the national carbon price as an example. And we're now at a point in time where these sort of provincial sort of separate solutions are being, people are looking at them and saying, like, it's impossible for us to make decisions that are really efficient unless we have a single way of being able to trade carbon across the country. I would also say that it, there are times when Canada as a country could have made decisions to work with the best in the world for certain sort of next steps. And I'll give the example of, I'll use the word taxonomy, but it's technical and it's not terribly descriptive. But basically setting performance standards for carbon intensity of major commodities. And one of the things that I found very surprising sometimes about Canada is, I guess, two things. One is that we hesitate to actually have a normative standard, or it's taken us a long time to establish normative standards. So a good example of that is, what is the carbon intensity of a low carbon fuel? So we've not done that, and that has made, I think, our lives really complicated from an investment perspective. Secondly, for whatever reason, we've not quickly run to work with those that are most advanced. And the example in this instance is the European emissions trading system, which is very much along the lines of what we started to do in Canada in 2007. But for whatever reason, we decided not to just become buddies and work together. And, I was just chatting with someone last week who works full time in China, and China has done that. They have just decided, hey, we're not going to do this on our own. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. We're going to go work with the European Union and make it easy. So those kind of, like, I don't know, having had a global career from the very beginning, my professional bias is always to work with those who are the best. And some of the things that surprise me and that have taken too many, led us to waste time, um, which will be costly in the end, or when others don't agree with that disposition. So I found myself kind of
Yeah.
waiting, right? So I was ready to work on things like performance standards for carbon intensity in 2018, and we're starting now. Yeah.
It's been
Yeah.
8 years.
That's a few
Yeah.
years.
Interesting. Okay. Doing well. Okay. So I guess the second last question I want to ask, what does give you the most optimism about Canada's overall potential right now in the clean tech industry?
Well, there are a few things. I mean, we have an increasing focus on attracting investment, right? And that is what keeps companies going, and what enables them to hire people, hire new graduates, hire experienced people. And so the focus on attracting investment is, I think, a very important one. We also have, I think, a renewed focus on regulation. A good example is one that I'm looking at right now, the low carbon fuels regulation, and it's how it compares to the US and making sure that we don't find ourselves in a position where we're reducing investment in Canada because we're importing things from the US as a good example. I mean, that, everything that has to
Mhm.
do with our being cognizant of the need to have our own sovereignty around energy, around environmental policy, and around trade policy, those are all things that make me optimistic. I live with a historian, my husband of 34 years, and one of the things about that comes with living with a 20th century historian is that you never assume that things are going to continue that the peace dividend is going to continue forever and that we'll always be happily trading with the US. I was paranoid when I wrote the clean technology reports, and that paranoia is now, I think, finally becoming a more widespread kind of
Yeah.
view, right? So that makes me optimistic as well.
Interesting and very timely for the industry right now. And I have one more question, and this is a bit more of a question that I wanted to ask on a personal note because we're at 4 o'clock now. I saw, and I just want to make sure I get this right. I have in my notes that you are a Knight of France's National Order. What does that mean, and how does that happen?
Well, when France took on the mandate to host COP21, it had told its diplomats that they needed to basically leave no stone unturned, that they needed to look at every possible way that COP21 would lead to an agreement, which became the Paris Agreement. And so those diplomats in Canada found themselves faced with a difficult situation because of the fact that there was a government that was nearing the end of its life, but the election had not yet occurred. And so they asked me to help. And I did that. So I acted a little bit as though I was a Canadian official, even though I was in the private sector and was just doing it because I thought it was the right thing to do. And so they took the trouble to ask the Canadian government if they could give me what are called honors. And I guess the government took about a year, I think, as it always does, to say yes. And then there was a very nice ceremony at the French embassy, and there's a medal that I can take out from time to time, or a little ribbon which I can wear on my lapel. So those are but I take that
Yeah.
responsibility seriously because it is something that, it just means that people took the trouble to thank me for something, and I therefore treat that as something I need to respect and honor.
Yeah, that is a pretty cool title to have. And also a really cool fun fact about yourself anytime
And
someone asks.
it's a masculine thing. I'm a chevalier. There's no feminine, so it's like I'm a guy
Awesome.
knight, not a chevalier. Funnily enough.
Yeah, awesome. That's awesome. So it's 4:02 now, and I think that kind of closes up the questions I wanted to ask. So thank you so much for participating in this. Do you have any final thoughts you want to add?
No, I just that, good for you all for taking the trouble to find people to, reflect on questions that are important for you, and keep doing that.
Thank you. It's been a really cool experience, and a lot of kudos to Julie for setting this up, as she has an arsenal of people behind her
Mhm.
that she knows. Thank you. I am excited and nervous.
All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.